You've heard of mighty emperors, Julius Caesar, Napoleon, Charlemagne, but none of them ruled more land than Charles V. He was emperor of a realm so vast, the sun never set on it. He commanded armies, shaped religions, and crowned popes. And yet, he couldn't even close his own mouth. Charles's grotesque underbite made him the most visibly deformed monarch in Europe. His jaw stuck so far forward, it permanently disfigured his face. He couldn't chew properly. He couldn't speak clearly. His lower jaw jutted past his upper lip like a grotesque shelf of bone. He had trouble breathing at night, and portraits often show him with pursed, tense lips or a drooping expression. But his deformity wasn't just a feature of his face. It was a symptom of something far darker. This was not simply poor luck or childhood illness. Charles V was the victim of generations of inbreeding, of dynastic pride turned medical tragedy. The jaw that disfigured his life was the signature of a cursed lineage. To understand Charles V, you have to go back, before the wars, before the empire, to the unholy union that created him. His mother, Joanna of Castile, was known as Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad. She was fiercely intelligent, deeply religious, and emotionally unstable. Her obsession with her husband, Philip, bordered on the pathological. When Philip died, Joanna refused to part with his corpse. For weeks, she traveled across Spain with his rotting body in a lead casket, opening it occasionally to caress him, to kiss him. She was eventually locked in a convent for the rest of her life. This was the woman who gave birth to Charles. His father, Philip the Handsome, was a Habsburg prince with sharp cheekbones, golden hair, and the infamous family chin. He was charismatic, adored by nobles and commoners alike. But he died young, possibly poisoned, and left Charles to inherit not only a fractured empire, but a fractured genetic legacy. From childhood, Charles was groomed for power, but dogged by whispers of his mother's insanity and his father's arrogance. He was educated in Latin, Flemish, Castilian, and French. He was drilled in military strategy, diplomacy, and Catholic doctrine. But his tutors noticed something else: his jaw. Even as a boy, his lower mandible protruded unnaturally. He struggled to pronounce words. His meals had to be softened or cut small. The deformity, known as mandibular prognathism, was already pronounced before puberty. It would grow worse with age. It was a family trait, a twisted badge of honor passed from one Habsburg to the next. The House of Habsburg had ruled for centuries by marrying within its own bloodline. Cousins married cousins. Uncles married nieces. Entire generations were the product of genetic loops. The goal was power, keep land and titles in the family. The result was genetic degeneration on a royal scale. Historians and geneticists have since traced the Habsburg facial deformity, the infamous jaw, across more than 15 generations. In Charles's case, his inbreeding coefficient was dangerously high, comparable to that of a child born from a brother-sister union. His parents, Joanna and Philip, were second cousins. Their shared ancestry meant that Charles had a double dose of defective genes. The deformity wasn't just cosmetic. It caused chronic migraines. It affected Charles's ability to eat and breathe. It distorted his speech, made him slur his words, and gave him a sluggish, heavy-lipped accent. Ambassadors described his face as unnatural and mask-like. Some even speculated he suffered from a condition known today as acromegaly, abnormal bone growth caused by hormonal imbalance. But more likely, his appearance was the predictable result of royal incest. Imagine being the most powerful man on earth and knowing that people wince when they look at you. Charles V couldn't escape his deformity. In portraits, his long chin dominates his face. He rarely smiles, partly because he was deeply devout and melancholic, but also because smiling exposed his warped jawline and misaligned teeth. His meals were a ritual of discomfort. Food had to be minced. He often ate alone. His jaw ached constantly, and he was prone to choking. At court, nobles whispered behind fans. Foreign emissaries took note of his strange appearance and awkward speech. Charles, ever self-aware, responded with silence, stoicism, and a terrifying sense of divine destiny. He saw his suffering as a burden from God, a test to purify his soul. But behind closed doors, he raged. Servants reported bouts of fury, objects thrown, doors slammed. He vented his frustration on his inner circle. His deformity was not just physical. It became the fuel of paranoia and control. Charles's official portraits were carefully curated. Artists like Titian were instructed to soften the jaw, to elongate the torso, to show power without exposing deformity. But the jaw could never be fully hidden. The portraits depict a man weighed down by authority and by bone. He appears stiff, heavy-lidded, melancholy. His jaw juts forward even when minimized by the artist's brush. In private sketches and contemporary accounts, the reality is more grotesque. One chronicler wrote that his lower teeth stuck out like a second set when he spoke. And yet, Charles ruled. Through his pain, through the stares, through the whispers, he ruled with iron purpose, driven by a belief that his deformity was part of divine providence, that God had marked him for a higher calling. But even divine missions can rot from the inside. Charles V passed his genes and his curse to the next generation. His son, Philip II, inherited a milder version of the jaw, but also the deep-set melancholy, the religious obsession, the coldness. Under Philip's reign, the Inquisition flourished. Spain descended into repression and financial ruin. But the dynasty continued. It was with Charles II of Spain, born over a century after Charles V, that the genetic collapse reached its peak. Charles II could barely speak, walk, or chew. He was infertile, mentally impaired, and constantly ill. His jaw was so deformed he could not close his mouth. He drooled constantly and could not eat without help. He was the end of the line. When Charles II died without an heir, the Spanish Habsburgs died with him. A dynasty destroyed not by war, but by its own blood. The Habsburg jaw became a symbol of decline, of the dangers of arrogance and insularity. The dynasty that believed it could define nature ended up consumed by it. Charles ruled one of the largest empires in history. He commanded armies, dictated the fate of nations, and lived with unbearable physical suffering. His life is a cautionary tale about power without limits, pride without perspective, and the human cost of political ambition. In the end, his jaw never closed. Not in life, not in death. It remained open, a grotesque echo of a lineage that thought it could shape the world, but couldn't escape its own reflection. Modern medicine has allowed us to look back at historical figures like Charles V and try to understand their ailments with greater clarity. What we once described simply as a Habsburg jaw can now be examined through the lens of genetic science. Charles V likely suffered from a severe case of mandibular prognathism combined with maxillary deficiency, a structural underdevelopment of the upper jaw. But this alone doesn't explain his pain, fatigue, and degenerative health in later life. Historians have speculated he may also have suffered from acromegaly, a hormonal disorder caused by excess growth hormone from the pituitary gland. Symptoms include abnormal bone growth, enlarged facial features, fatigue, headaches, and joint pain. These would match many of the documented experiences of Charles: chronic pain, deformity, and neurological complaints. Others propose he had Cushing's syndrome, characterized by weight gain, fragile skin, and mood swings, all things observed in his letters and portraits. However, his condition was almost certainly made worse by the inbreeding that marked the Habsburg family tree. The portrait of Charles V is one not just of power, but of a man whose body was slowly collapsing in on itself. Charles V was the most powerful man in Europe, but power did not shield him from scrutiny. In fact, the more powerful he became, the more his deformity was noticed and dissected. Ambassadors from France, England, and the Ottoman Empire all commented on his appearance. Some mocked it. Others expressed pity. The Venetian ambassador wrote in a coded dispatch, "He is a man of strong will, but with the mouth of a beast." English observers noted that while his speech was dignified, it was often unclear. His chin moved heavily. His words were muffled. He appeared noble, they said, but ill. Ottoman records even describe the emperor as being cursed from the womb, noting that Allah had burdened the Christian king with a grotesque feature. For enemies of the Habsburg crown, Charles's appearance became a metaphor. His protruding jaw represented decadence, divine judgment, or the failing morality of Christendom. For allies, it was a mark of sacrifice, a saintly suffering that proved his connection to God. In the shadows of Europe's palaces, Charles's deformity became a conversation, a curiosity, a caution. In Charles's time, deformity was not just a medical matter, it was a spiritual one. The Christian worldview saw the body as a vessel for divine or demonic intervention. Many believed deformities were signs from God, either as punishment for sin or as evidence of sanctity through suffering. Charles himself leaned into this belief. He viewed his jaw as both a test and a burden. He fasted frequently, wore hair shirts beneath his royal garments, and confessed obsessively. He believed his suffering drew him closer to God. In sermons preached at his court, priests sometimes referenced his condition directly, calling the emperor a man of earthly scars and heavenly spirit. Theologians at the time wrote essays comparing his facial deformity to the thorns of Christ, suggesting that like Christ's crown of suffering, Charles's face was his symbol of sacrifice. It's likely Charles believed this. It's likely he needed to believe this. In a world where kings were seen as God's chosen, the grotesqueness of his body had to be more than coincidence. It had to be holy. Behind the gold, velvet, and ceremony, Charles V lived a life of small, constant suffering. His mornings began with prayer, often at dawn. His attendants would help him dress. Brushing his teeth required custom-made brushes to navigate his misshapen mouth. Breakfast was light and soft. Warm milk, mashed fruit, thin bread. Eating was a ritual of frustration. Food stuck in his teeth. He chewed slowly and painfully. Often he would excuse himself early or retreat to a side chamber to eat in private. He used perfumed cloths to mask halitosis, a common side effect of dental deformity. His painkillers included wine infused with opiates or myrrh. He suffered headaches, often retiring early to his chambers. At night, his jaw ached. He would hold his chin in his hand while reading or praying. He often fell asleep with a cloth tied around his face, meant to press his mouth closed and reduce the strain. For a man believed to be appointed by God, life in his own body was a prison. The death mask of Charles V, now preserved in Spanish archives, offers one of the most haunting relics of royal history. Even in death, his jaw dominates. His face appears sunken. The mouth gapes slightly. His skin appears thin and stretched. When his body was exhumed years later, scribes recorded the condition of his skeleton. The jawbone was massive. The lower teeth jutted forward at a grotesque angle. The skull confirmed what portraits only hinted at: a man deformed not just by fate, but by his family's obsession with power. Today, statues of Charles V still stand across Europe, but artists, even in marble, have continued to soften his features, to romanticize the man. Yet beneath the stone lies the truth, a jaw that ruined a life, a dynasty that ignored science and morality, a warning carved in bone, and a jaw that even God couldn't close.